A very warm welcome to all of you. Some familiar names on the session today and some newer colleagues. So wherever you are joining from in terms of organization or geography, you're most welcome. We're glad to have you with us today. So we have an excellent lineup in store for you in the first of two webinars actually that we're going to be running on this same topic around clients and creativity. Yes, and today, as you've seen, we're going to have Ed Bell from Cathay Pacific, as well as Lucinda Peniston-Baines from Observatory and Natalie Lamb from Publicis Groupe, and we're introducing more detail in a second. But for those of you who are newer to these webinars, we try and make these as interactive as possible. So you should see the Q&A and the chat widget at the bottom. So feel free to post comments within the chat and also to post your questions, which we will find some time at the end of this session to put to our excellent speakers. And before we crack on to answer two questions, we should have you with us for less than an hour today, probably about 50 minutes. And yes, we will be making a recording of this session and the slides available for those of you to share with your colleagues if that's helpful. Just two slides about the WFA in case you are new to our organization. We're proud to have 60 national advertiser associations in membership, and I know some of you are joining the webinar today, and some of those members of those organizations joining today, and we also have now over 140 company members, corporate members as we call them, as you can see here. So whichever member you're representing, a very warm welcome to all of you. Delighted to have you with us today. Those of you who know WFA know that we're focused a lot on the micro values. So for members, for example, through webinars like this and research that we're going to be talking about. But as an industry body, we also, of course, focus on the macro leadership initiatives, which I've framed for simplicity's sake within the ESG context here. And you may be wondering why on earth I'm talking about that on a session around clients and creativity. Well, the answer is that some of the world's biggest problems are outlined by the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The majority of you say actually creativity is what we can really bring to the party, the most valuable contribution marketing can make to try and address some of those challenges. And I know, for example, from a planet perspective around COP26 or soon COP27, a lot of those organizations saying that actually that's what they need from brand owners and from marketers. And that's why we're so welcome to the table. But not just from a planet perspective as well, also from people perspective, so diversity. So here I'm referencing some work from my colleague Camilla, and our excellent DEI task force around these stages where brand owners can address bias in the creative process. And I'm sure we'll know that without diversity of talent, then we're going to be lacking diversity of thought, which obviously impacts on creative effectiveness. But despite understanding the importance of creativity in terms of driving the business and also addressing some of the world's biggest problems, we know from IPA and some of the best minds in our industry, if you like, Orlando Wood, Peter Field, Les Binet, they help us understand that actually creative communications effectiveness continues to be in decline. And at the same time, you hear a lot of us that actually we're too focused on the problems and the plumbing and not enough on the people and the art. And that really was the genesis of this project around clients and creativity. So we're aware that there's a great amount of work being done, for example, platforms like Cannes Lions or Spikes or different industry bodies. This is designed to complement that work, but exclusively focus around clients and some of the client-centric barriers to creativity and how we might look to address these. And happily, thanks in no small part to my colleague, Ioana Danila, whose face you might have seen pop up a second ago. We had a superb sample of informed brand builders, so 640 client-side marketers from around the world, from 34 different countries. So a truly global sample. And I must give credit to these excellent advertiser associations, without whom this project would not have had the scale and the footprint that it did. So you might know, for example, ANA in the US, or in Asia, thinking about PANA in the Philippines, or ISA in India. But thank you. I know quite a few of you are on this webinar today. Thank you for your ongoing partnership. It's very much appreciated. So now, also involved in this project, beyond our national advertiser associations, we also had 2 strategic partners. So Contagious, you might have come across before, and also longtime partner Observatory International. We're delighted to have Lucinda Peniston-Baines joining us today from the Observatory International, and she's going to talk us through some of the sort of headline findings from this research, which, by the way, is free and available for you to download on the WFA website. So a very warm welcome back, Lucinda, to the WFA. Good to see you.
Thanks, Rob. Great to be here.
And before I hand over, actually, I thought maybe we turn it to our members, and just a quick question, see how honest they're feeling. I was going to say this morning, but this afternoon in Asia Pacific. Perhaps, Joel, you can throw up the poll for our members, because one of the first areas Lucinda's going to focus on is around briefing. So we were just keen to get your perspectives around whether how you feel you perform as an organization in relation to briefing. So hopefully you should be seeing this in front of you now. 4 options. How would you rate your company's performance in terms of briefing? Either excellent, we're top of the game, good, we tend to inspire, average, there's plenty of room for improvement, or more confusing than inspiring. So it should be interesting
Fingers
to
crossed.
see. Yeah, exactly. So Joelle, once we've had a decent number of respondents to this, it would be great if you could post up the results. Okay, should be seeing the result. Oh, it's quite an honest group, Lucinda.
It's a very honest group, actually.
Yeah, good for you.
Excellent.
Yeah.
It is interesting because in years gone by, and even recently, when we've undertaken research around the topic of briefing, there isn't too much self-reflection, actually, that there's room for improvement. So
yeah.
Whilst it's probably a little bit, it sort of helps to tell the story, I suppose, actually seeing which will come. But thank you. Yeah, good, honest room. So I think we'll get some great questions, good debate.
Well,
great.
Over to you.
Thank you. And thanks again for being here. It was fascinating helping to put this report together with our partner Contagious and the WFA. It's absolutely packed full of observations and insights around this topic area. And we'll come on to talk about that with the panelists in a minute too, because there's a lot in there about what is and isn't working in terms of helping organizations to elevate creativity within their business. But then there's also a great deal about practicalities of actually how to deliver on that ambition, improve creativity. So we'll talk to that in a moment, but I did just want to pick up on sort of 3 key things that stood out for me when we came to write up Paul. The first one, as Rob alluded to, and you've been kind enough to reflect, poll is around briefing. And you can see on this chart, it's seen as the number 2 enabler in terms of driving creativity. To us at the Observatory International, we work at the intersection of clients and agents, therefore ways of working and process being absolutely critical to that. To us, we see briefing as kind of the killer app. It's at the root of enabling both the most effective work to come out, but also enabling that to happen in the most efficient way as well. It's the chance to allow your agencies to kind of get it right first time. But it's not something that people are born with. It's not a sort of God-given right that you know how to write a brief. It takes a huge amount of practice, training, brutal editing skills. It takes absolute focus. And to us, whilst it's kind of table stakes stuff that every marketer should be able to write an absolutely brilliant brief, I think with training having really slipped down the agenda over the last few years, the investment into people, we can't assume that everybody actually has got that skill as honed as it really should be. So to us, we think that there really needs to be a focus on making sure that that is at the root of all new marketers coming into the organization, but also refreshers for even long-term market. I think it can be really to just refocus. So templates, practice, focus on brevity. On which note, I'll move on to the next chart, Rob, in the intro. The second really interesting point we thought was around this too many cooks. This came in at number 3 in block. How would you say your organization relation? And you can see the stats here that it's only moderate or well. And this is really down to this too many decision makers, too many cooks. Even creating a local market is complex. The number of stakeholders that are involved in that can be very, very challenging. The people on this call today, you're all international marketeers, procurement colleagues, or organizations. So you'll recognize the added complexity there is to developing work where you've got to involve your local or regional and global stakeholders in developing work that might run across multi-market. So just to quote Vicky Free from Adidas, who was featured in this report, she said, "Creativity and innovation is not a democratic process. Everyone does not voice." And I think that that is something that is worth remembering. Bringing stakeholders along with you in the creative development process is important. They need to have a voice at the right points. They need to feel that they've got a say in the development of the work, so that when you try and ultimately run it at a local market level or regional level, they've got buy-in along the way. But at the same time, you need to be absolutely clear who the decision maker is, and that should be inked into the briefing that we've just been talking about on the previous chart. A really clear, racy, responsible, accountable is absolutely cool in helping make sure that you don't just get bland work that's developed by. And then the final point to make on the next chart is around risk-averse culture. This came in, you'll see at the very top of the chart here, is the number one blocker to creativity within the organization. I mean, lots of different elements combine to create a risk-averse culture. And those, again, when you dive into this report, you'll see a lot around short-term focus there, for example, a focus on sales rather than long-term brand, a lack of confidence in some of the skills that we've just been talking, briefing or creative judgment. That all leads to a risk-averse culture. But the other thing that I think is worth highlighting that can sort of exacerbate this is an over-focus on research. We're big believers in research and support our clients in terms of their use of it, but I think it needs to have the right place. If I'm making it up, but confectionery client is going to the same source humour insight, you tend to see the same work coming out the other end. Or indeed, if there's an over-reliance on creative testing, tend to see very safe work at the end of it. And it can become a bit of a blanket and lead to conventional work. So finding that right balance between head, heart, and really helpful tools like research is important. But it just to us again underline the skills that are needed by marketeers around creative judgment. It's yet another skill that is like a muscle. It needs to be exercised. It needs to be used to make sure that it's really a skill that's well honed. The last point I'd make on this, though, is point it back to agencies. Sometimes agencies can accuse their clients of not being brave enough to buy an idea, and I think as clients, you do also need to make sure that they're not using the excuse of your organization being risk averse to actually push through an idea that might not truly be on budget or on brand, rather, I would say, or on brief. So make sure that you are ready and prepared to push back on those ideas. So those are just three sort of headline areas that I wanted to touch on. And now I'd love to bring in, first of all, Ed Bell from Cathay Pacific, just to spend a few minutes with any reflections that you may have had on the report as you've seen it, and also perhaps whether there's any specific areas around regional differences that you picked for. So Ed, welcome. You're on mute at the moment, Ed.
Right, it's unmuting me. Can you see me and hear me okay?
Absolutely.
Cool. Well, I think this is fascinating. I thank you for the research. Cathay, we've had our fair shares of ups and downs, but I think it's fair to say that we've been really reliant on a high degree of cooperation with our agencies over the past few years, whilst we've tried to navigate the waters that we're in. We relaunched our brand in 2019, and after that, with street protests, and then with COVID, we found ourselves having to change direction multiple times. We had to produce quite quickly a whole series of content about kind of COVID protection. Then we realized we were ignoring the emotional bond with our customers and needed to kind of get those guys back. So we've really lurched between many different things, responding to the demands placed upon us. But I think that in thinking about the research, there are a few things in the bigger picture that come to mind for me. I do feel like the relationship with the agency, as a person with an agency background myself, I feel like the relationship with our agencies is less cornerstone-like than it used to be when I was on the agency side working with corporate. And I think it's for a few reasons. I think the creativity, is less, it's become a smaller part of the corporate agenda. And I think it also because marketing has become a smaller part of the corporate agenda. At Cathay right now, maybe like many other, kind of large organizations, we're currently adopting agile at scale, right? This kind of way of working. And I think it's interesting, the whole setup of it, what it's doing is it's saying the whole thing is positioned as we're living in the software age, and corporations need to learn from software companies. And in order to be able to grow as freely as they do and adopt ideas as quickly as they do, you need to change your model of operation to kind of this, scaled agile. And I think what it's done, it's made that changing the system of corporations and the adoption of these technologies has become, I think, the core focus of so many corporations now. And it's not that marketing and building brand narratives and product narratives and building those bonds with consumers is no longer important. I just think it's been pushed out of the agenda a little bit. It's been pushed down the scale. But interestingly, I think companies that have adopted those technologies earlier, and the ones I think who are smarter, wiser at marketing and building demand, they've never lost this link, and they're kind of coming back to emotional storytelling. So I think that's one of the things that I've noted. I think the other thing that has changed is that I feel that the scale of impact of marketing now we're in this age of targeting, and we're in this age of hyper targeting, or what Salesforce would talk about, segments of one. This whole model of thinking, what it's done is it's made the scale of marketing's impact smaller and less visible. And I think what that's done is it's made marketing not so much a big ticket item as it used to be. So I think that's the other reason why it's not quite middle of the agenda, and why the relationship between the corporation and the agency partners becomes slightly less important. I think this point about braveness and being brave, I think, is a really interesting one. And I have a conflict about it, because on the one hand, I felt like part of what corporations are missing in their path to market strategies is the role of the planner. And I think that it used to be such a pivotal role. The planner was almost like kind of soothsaying or kind of guiding, ways to market. But I feel like that role is nowhere near as clear as it was before. And I think part of what it used to be was that the planner would help, the CMO manage risk, because it wasn't about good companies are brave and bad companies are not brave, and you just need to be brave. I think, in my mind, only stupid people rely on courage. I think the corporations were always smarter about understanding the nature of the risk. And the strategy helped you to understand where you were taking a risk and how you can mitigate against that. And the planner would provide you ways to know what kinds of risks they were. But I feel like with the reduced role of the planner, somehow the risks now maybe feel large. And now I think a lot of companies feel like this idea of being brave is maybe old thing. And in the modern world, you just divide up these large problems into smaller problems. This is part of this agile thinking. So as a result of that, I think we're losing a little bit. And I think through the missing that role of the planner, the importance of the marketing strategy is not as clear as it was. And I think, you made the point about with a lot of the digital advertising and a lot of the digital presence, it feels like things are more similar than they used to be. And I think the importance of distinctiveness is lost a little bit. And so I think that corporations are finding it harder to articulate their marketing strategy, because of all of the reasons I've been talking about. And I think that's just, there's, I think, less confidence within organizations now about where we are with our marketing strategy and is it as reliable as it used to be. And I can totally relate to that chart from the IPA about the declining effectiveness. I really think that's what's going on. So we do need to get back to a more strategic relationship with the agencies, but I think we have to address some of these other points that I've raised, though, to get there.
Thanks, Ed. That's some really interesting points, which I'd love to come back to when we kind of open up to some questions shortly. Perhaps I could bring Natalie in now, though, to give her reflections through the perspective of the agency lens. Natalie, it would be great to hear from you.
Hi, thanks for having me. Hey, Ed.
Hi, Natalie.
I know you know each other, so.
I got to be careful what I say, because Natalie is our agency. So I'm kind of like, I don't want to get in trouble with Natalie.
You're saying all the things that we want to hear in terms of the client-agency relationship.
Yeah,
we want become more elevated and strategic.
Good. We want the gloves off today. But Natalie, if you've got any initial kind of reflections or observations on the report as you've seen.
Yeah, so I thought I found, I'm definitely not going to sound as strategic and smart as Ed, so I'm going to use very, very plain, simple language. I absolutely think that there's a few points. I mean, obviously one point was the best practice. Is the best practice actually at the top of the bar, or should it be the starting point? I think, unfortunately, I think a lot of times, I mean, in our markets where you and I were just chatting before everybody else joined, that especially in Asia, it's all about speed, right? It's about the speed and quantity. So a lot of times clients are relying on best practice to say, we want that. And unfortunately, there's no room, no time, no resource for more. And then I think if we shift the mindset and I think of best practice actually is the standard practice. And then how do you rise above the standard to plus it up? I think that is where the opportunity to become more creative and then to differentiate, yourself from another brand that everybody, the best practice. I mean, one of the running jokes is always, we're all being trained by the platform. For example, as simple as the logo shows up in the first 3 seconds, right? So, I mean, that itself is a simple best practice, but is that necessarily the best way to get your brand noticed? I mean, getting your brand and your message noticed is the messages. It's your point of view. It's not whether people notice your logo or not before they keep scrolling. So I think that's a very, very interesting point that you guys brought up that I thought, it's helps reframe what we are in. And then absolutely, I think too many cooks. It's something that we constantly face, right? Especially, some markets where definitely consensus-driven markets, right? I mean, it's quite interesting because I came from spending a long time in New York and just returning to Hong Kong. This is where I came, and even just looking at the bigger context of how the two societies, the two worlds treat COVID is a stark difference, because here is a group-oriented society. So, your own well-being actually affects everybody else. So you have to be careful not to get sick, because, if you do get sick, it's not just your own problem. It is everybody else. So you can't afford to take on the responsibility in a way to not. And then so I think having that culture where everybody needs to agree, and in larger work, right, global, regional, and local all need to be aligned. And then the reality also is there's a lot of times the so-called local culture from one country to the next neighboring country is completely different. So how do you reach consensus, get everybody's buy-in, but yet keep the bigger vision of the brand in mind? That's absolutely a real challenge. And then being able to navigate it is, it's, I think, a skill that creatives need to really learn in some of these markets beyond, the core creative being. Also another point that I thought is quite interesting is short-termism. I mean, again, I think, if you look at the work, right, coming from creativity, and I definitely agree with that. Back in the days, I would say maybe a decade ago, agencies' roles are so much more critical with clients, right? There were a lot of true partnership. Therefore, you see, famous partnerships between the best agents and the biggest brands in the world. It's harder to see it now. And also, if you look at the work, I would say a decade ago, work is so much more fun. And then people, there weren't so many restrictions of serving a purpose, being careful, and the core sort of being crazy, silly, being playful, that all of those are the fundamentals of being creative, right? Thinking outside the box, and then sometimes act irresponsibly a little bit, but still, for the end result is benefiting the brand. Long-term brand building has becoming so hard these days, and I think it's a few different things. One is it's a very scattered media landscape. Oftentimes we get a brief that needs to solve all the brand and products challenges, tick a lot of boxes in one go, right? And then it becomes very much, I would say, actually effectiveness driven rather than creative driven. So the balance being, basically it's been off balance. The brief is 100 check boxes, and then I think that's also the nature of being a client nowadays. There's so much pressure, and then there's so much sort of like, to do in a market year. So how do you rise above that to actually take a step back and then have some room? Because I think everybody's smart, right? Everybody's smart, everybody to do their best, whether it's agent. But when you have no room to breathe, just trying to check all the boxes, right in front of you. It's hard to take a step back and think of something big that actually is simpler but better fitting for a long-term brand build. So I think the long-term, the short-termism that affects the brief versus the long-term brand building goals that are probably much more time consuming and need to have even more stakeholder approved involved. It just feels like an impossible task nowadays, and great clients and great briefs like that just it doesn't come along as often as if you look at 10 years back, right? I mean, the heydays of the Crispins of the world, all the Dante's silly, crazy work. I mean, I still think that, for example, the Volvo Jean-Claude Van Damme Epic Spit, one of the silliest, you don't know you need it, but very effective product demos in the world. So how do we bring back that type of fun and joy? I mean, creativity is a very fun thing to do, right? How do you bring back the fun to what we do by being more long-term, by challenging best practices, by also helping both sides navigate a lot of stakeholders. I think those some of the top learning discoveries that I.
Fantastic, thank you. Thanks both of you for those reflections about bringing back the fun. It resonates with me. My background is originally before the Observatory was creative agencies as well back in the 90s. So I hanker back to some of that myself. I think from both of you some really interesting points, and I'm going to come on to a couple of questions, but just to pick up on one or two things that both of you said. Natalie, to your point about short and long, the bigger idea stuff versus, I loved your quote about, we're being trained by the platform. I thought it was really, do we think creativity is a big word, and should we be thinking about different creative skills that should be needed and are needed by clients through their partners and within their own, be able to serve, or it's very fragmented?
Yeah, I definitely think that there's two parts to that, right? One, I think everybody can be a creative thing. It doesn't matter what skills you come with. So, if you have a curious mind, if you can think outside the box, you can be creative with everything. And then part two is the skills, right? You do need certain, as a writer, you do need to be able to write well, at least spell right? So it starts with a very, very important course. So I think unfortunately, some agencies and setups, they just look for sort of like, they're a bit rigid, and then they still look for sort of similar types of people, and they sort of screen out, interesting creative mind that they can bring into the mix. And then there's other areas. I mean, I would say probably like the emerging social media. Well, social media agencies already pretty old news, right? The content agencies, the Web3 agencies, they are so quick in jumping on the latest trends, but then I think they're probably missing some of the important fundamental creative training, basic of being specialists and craftsmen. So I think the best of both worlds is definitely a mix of, understanding these two core elements that they're to be there. One, you're able to think creatively, and two, you actually have the right skill sets and then the right to get there. Yeah, that's for having a good of creative people who are relevant to the time. For me, relevancy is a big, because I mean, we all come from, an era. For example, if you come up with age in the social media era, you may be scared of Web3, right? But then you still have to do it. And there's all these things will always change. Every 3 years, there will be a new term. So how do you not miss the core of it? Is this a great idea? Is this good for the brand? Is this good for the business? Do people care? But stay relevant and stay flexible and curious. You're surrounding yourself with the latest and greatest who know these changing trends, techniques, tools, and that's the way to go. I mean, I've seen some places where they still insist on hiring the same breed of probably like big, beautiful manifesto creatives, and then often that becomes irrelevant, right? When the brief is, hey, how do you really connect with social media consumers who are just used to scrolling nonstop and not have 2 seconds to listen to what you that's have to say.
It's a very good point. I'm going to bring that back to Ed, if I may, and so posing one which is around briefing. I mean, as we just described, there are many different, you talked actually, Ed, about the role of the planner and helping to navigate, what should that marketing strategy look like, and therefore where do you brief? I mean, in terms of briefing and coming back into the client rather than the agent, do you feel, you've been in the business for a while, and say your agency side, do you think that from a client view, briefing improved or declined? Have you got a good example of how you brief to overcome and what?
Well, that's a great question, and with Natalie on the receiving end of our briefs, I actually feel a bit embarrassed because sometimes things are so busy, as Natalie was saying. I think the modern day CMO, you're involved in so many things. Even because I represent the brand too, so I'm involved in the design of the seats. I mean, I think the role has become a lot broader. So sometimes, I ask the team, I see the brief, and then you start reading the brief and you go, what? We're going to send this to the agency? Are you serious? There's no KPIs, there's no proposition, there's nothing. So I really feel that the standard of briefing from clients has definitely declined, because I think that the client side marketers were also trained by the agency scene. I think that was always the relationship. And I think, when I was younger in this business, I remember you'd be in the room and you'd have these senior planners and these agency heads and these creative directors, and they would talk to you about the efficiency of language, and they'd talk to you about, framing through the proposition, framing your competitive set differently. I feel like a lot of those skills are probably, I'm not sure nowadays people really have much of a fluency of those skills. So, again, I think that on the client side, I would question whether the clients have built the marketing organizations that they need to be able to get the outcomes that they desire. I think there's a gap. And I think that a lot of times too, companies like Cathay and other large companies, look to Apple and these companies who are consistently doing interesting things and having huge returns on their marketing campaigns without knowing the discipline that they put in place to get to those outcomes. So I think there's a gap in terms of the work, the skill sets, the disciplines that the client side needs to have to direct the agency resource in a proper way. I'm not sure the clients are really aware of. I do think that's an issue that could be addressed. I think it's an opportunity for agencies too, and the consult like Observatory, to help organizations understand how they can get more out of their agency relationships, for sure, and what the relationship that has with ROI. I think also client organization. The thing is about, as I said, in my opinion, the last 10 years, client sides have become, their brains have been stretched to the max to try and understand technology and technology platforms, emerging databases. And I think this has really stressed out organizations. And as a result of that, I think senior management within organizations, it's quite expensive to do those things. And the payback is a long-term payback. The initial investment is very large. I think comparatively, the investment in ambitious marketing campaigns is a lot smaller and the ROI is a lot bigger. But I think people have lost this point because it's almost like it's faded in the collective memory. And I think marketing and agencies need to get back in front of the decision makers, CFOs, the CEOs, with, hey, here's marketing. Remember us. Here's what we can do for you. I was just this morning, as an aside, I was talking with a colleague about, we've got these challenges. We're trying to, accelerate how many people join our lifestyle team, sign up as a Cathay member. He was reminding me of a time when Qantas, years ago in Australia, said, you have to now sign on to Qantas Frequent Flyer. And they spent $10 million Australian on this kind of big campaign. And it was a kind of vote now kind of thing. The payback was 500 million Australian dollars. I mean, these kinds of huge returns, I remember this in my younger days. I remember going to Cannes and hearing about these kinds of campaigns. You don't hear about that now. I think the corporate memory has lost sight of what marketing can do. And I think collectively we've allowed, the C-suite to lose touch with really the muscles that we have.
And yet the demand to be growth drivers within the organization hasn't gone away. So it's a real tension.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's the only thing I would disagree with Natalie. I mean, a short-term ROI focus is damaging. I would agree, because that can make everything about efficiency. And that does get to kind of cost per click and all these things. But effectiveness, in my opinion, is the way back. I think without that, it looks a little bit like marketing could look like an indulgence. I think effectiveness is the key.
I can see there's lots of questions, and I know that Rob posed a couple to you. I'll just ask one final question, Rob, if that's all right, and then I'll hand to you for the chat. But just briefly coming back to you, Ed, and sorry, Natalie, because I know you're going to be given some questions by Rob. But Ed, the point that I made earlier about management, I just wondered how how you either avoid that decision by given Natalie's about decision making, any experience or guide?
Yeah, I think the corporate structures had become flatter and wider. This is partly driven by the wisdom of software, as I talked about. I think this is very much in trend. I think the idea of a hierarchy is an old-fashioned thing, and I think everyone wants to have a corporate structure like Google. So it's whether you like it or not, there's many more stakeholders. But I think the antidote is through relationship. And I think that's one thing I learned from the agency side is you can't get anything done in an agency without relationships. And you can't sell anything to your client without trust. Comes back to longevity, agency people sticking around. I mean, to me, it's all part of that. I think on the client side, if you've earned something, you can say to the CEO or the CFO, look, trust me, I've got this. You just have to kind of go with me. Without that, then everything becomes a counsel. Yeah, it's pretty tough.
Great, thanks very much. Rob, I'll hand over to you because I haven't read the questions, but I can see that there are quite a few.
Yes, absolutely. And I encourage anyone else to post questions that they may have. Thanks all three of you already for your contributions. Lucinda, I'd welcome your responses to these as well, which is why I wanted to step in. But there was one question that came from Enrique from Sanofi, which really resonates because it's a question that we have. We're trying with the research move towards solutions. Enrique asks, what in your opinion is the best way to build creativity assessment skills for marketers? Obviously, we're focused on the client side here. Are there specific tools or dynamics you would recommend? And perhaps we start with Natalie. No pressure.
Okay.
Or anyone who feels they want to respond. But.
Yeah, I'm always gonna give the super simple layman version. I'm very afraid of tools, so I think a lot of times I think it's about having the culture that everybody should be accountable and should be responsible, that what you're making is a great idea, cut through, but also work. I think we all consume, we're both at the same time professionals, and then on the other hand we're consumers, right? We consume content, we browse social media, we walk down the street, we see a lot of messages, products screaming for us to buy. So we have pretty good common sense judgment in what works and what doesn't, right? So I think a lot of challenges that I've been seeing is on creatives end, they come up with these ideas that they get so excited about. They're like, this is the best in the world. But then I would push back and be like, really? Would that work? Is it relevant at all? And is it still one-way corporate communication trying to tell something to the audience? Where's the exchange, right? So I think agencies need to be more responsible. Everybody needs to be have ownership as if they are running the brand or they are, kind of marketing the brand. Would this work? And if it doesn't yet, fill in the piece that completes the picture. And then I think from the marketer's standpoint, I'm sure you have a lot of tools to measure, right? But then if that measurement is not understood by the agencies, I think the media, usually the reality is in the agencies, the media's people will understand numbers the most. The account people, maybe a little bit. And then the creatives, they never see those decks. So the lack of, the importance of business objectives from the clients and to when it landed on the brief and, translates to a campaign that has XYZ element. That disconnect, I think, needs to be short. So if everybody has ownership and understand the business challenges, understand what's critical, and then apply creative problem solving to it, I think that is the core culture that we need to build. Right. Sometimes these informations are so compartmentalized that they never gets translated to the quote unquote.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. Ed, when you look at your team and see how they respond to proposals and judging creativity, is there any steps that you'd suggest or processes that you've put in place to try and improve those skills internally within Cathay or any other organizations perhaps?
I don't have any magic box. We'd all remember the big ad testing industry that used to exist. I think just totally disappeared, right? I think that was once upon a time the CMO's best friend. Keep your job. Right, to make sure you weren't going to sink, $500,000 of media into something that wasn't going to work. I think with TV advertising going away, that has also now really gone away. So ironically, I think on the client side, we're almost left to our own devices to determine if something's right or not. And I think there on the client side, I think there's two factors at play. One is what will the bosses think? Can we get this through? And it's not really glamorous to say it, but I think it's the reality. Everyone's going to think that. But in terms of our responsibility, I think the number one driver has to be, what does your gut tell you? Is it exciting to you? And if you try and, I always think in marketing, our job in the organization is to try and put ourselves in the consumer shoes. If I was a consumer, would I be excited about that? And I think that's got to be the main filter and the most reliable tool I think that we have today. It's not very scientific, but I think it's the number one thing.
If I just add like 30 seconds on that, I mean,
Yeah,
so we train marketers in terms of creative evaluation. We use a very simple, I hate those overuse of tools as well, but just a framework around idea versus execution. And it is a list. So I hate checkboxes also, but it is just a fundamental way of looking at ideas as they're being able to remove some of the activity out of it by just following some simple questions to test yourself. One of which, to your point, Ed, is absolutely, does this excite me? Would I be proud? So there's some very emotional things about as well as, but those are the skills I mentioned. It is a muscle. Nobody's born with that gift. Well, probably Natalie is born with the gift actually of knowing great creative work, but not everybody is. So it does need to be practiced
and invested in terms of capabilities training and upskilling. So thank you. A couple of people have mentioned about the sort of complexity of the media landscape, so the fragmentation of channels that exist out there. But David from Procter & Gamble asked an interesting one. He was talking about briefing outside of classic agency structures. So for example, creators, and Natalie, you mentioned about working with the platforms, but how do you brief those creators in a way that respects the brand but gives those creators the needed flexibility, letting go a bit of control? And Ed, do you have any thoughts on, is it the same process or?
Natalie, Rob, would you like me to answer, or Natalie?
Please, yeah. Sorry, Ed, I was turning to you first.
Oh yeah, it is a different way of working. So when we're working with creators, or the Wang Hong in China, the influencers, it's like a partnership with an author. It's a different kind of thing, and you have to come to the party. So you're briefing them, but you're also working with them in terms of how they want to work. Certainly the more famous ones. So it's not a one-way process. It's a two-way process, and yeah, it's kind of like a negotiation. So that can be slightly unnerving, and you do have to give up some control. But then again, you are leveraging them as identities. It's the same thing as working with major celebrities. They don't do everything that you want. It's a negotiation. I think it's a very similar thing. You have more control with the agency, of course, if you're not using borrowed interest. So yeah, I think in that outside of the normal channels, it's difficult. And I do think it is quite high risk. Oh, I'm mute, I think, Rob.
Yeah,
I had to do that at least once during this webinar. It's compulsory. Natalie, obviously you represent agencies on this webinars, but any thoughts on that in terms of guidance for brands?
so I think the biggest job and the most important piece of this is choose the influence and creators well. In the very, very, very beginning, because I think the most common mistake and challenge is, okay, there's so many of them, and then they represent so many different flavors. But the first and foremost is, just because of their celebrity, is it good for the brand? So I think if you encourage your team to put in a lot more effort to pick the ones that had that really unique something that is perfect for the brand, that's tough work, right? But I think that's a really critical starting point. And then once you put in the work, due diligence to do that, then yes, it's going to be case by case. Some are easier to work with, some are very, very sort of individual. But I think the most critical point is be selective who you work and know them inside out. What are they about? And then align who they are with your, because I've seen too many cases where it's pretty much, one influencer or one creator just works with every single brand under the sun. And then that also cheapens, why you do it. Like, where's the brand's role in this besides being able to afford to pay, and also aiming for massive exposure.
Fantastic. And I'm sorry, time always flies by with these things, doesn't it? You feel like you've budgeted time correctly, but I'm afraid we're going to need to draw to a close now. But I just wanted to say, on behalf of everyone who joined the webinar here today, thank you so much to all three of you for joining and sharing so candidly. We're not massively comfortable uncomfortable when you've got your client on the same webinar and you're asked to comment on creative capabilities within the client-side organization. But thank you all so much for joining us today. And one non-commercial break just at the end here for WFA members who are aware, our next session that we will be holding will be in Amsterdam, focused on marketing effectiveness. And we have Mark Ritson joining us on November the 8th. So if you've not registered, obviously marketing effectiveness intrinsically linked to the discussions around clients and creativity today. So please register now if you haven't already, and do take a second to respond and let us know how you felt this went today, and help inform the session tomorrow, which involves Heineken and Contagious. Natalie, Ed, Lucinda, thank you all very much again, and thank you to all of our members who joined and for all of your questions. So we didn't get a chance to get to. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks a
And
lot.
hopefully see
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.